On the 14th of August, in the year 1879, in a dusty crossroads settlement called Bitter Creek in the Kansas Territory, a woman named Margaret Doyle paid 4 cents for a bent, rusted horseshoe that a blacksmith's boy had thrown onto the scrap pile behind the livery. 4 cents. Let me tell you exactly what 4 cents bought in Bitter Creek that summer. It bought a single egg, or a spool of cheap thread, or half a plug of chewing tobacco, or, if you were foolish enough to want it, 1 rusted horseshoe that no rancher within 30 miles would have bent down to pick up off the road. The men lounging outside the livery that afternoon laughed so hard that one of them had to sit down on a feed barrel to catch his breath, because standing not 10 feet from them was a woman everyone in town knew as the Widow Doyle, a woman who slept some nights in the loft above the mercantile and other nights in the old cattle barn at the edge of the Pruitt spread. A woman whose husband had died of a fever 2 winters back and left her with nothing but his name and a trunk of tools nobody thought a woman had any business owning. And here she was, this same widow, digging through a scrap heap of broken iron and paying good coin for the ugliest piece of it. What do you see when you look at a bent horseshoe half buried in the dirt behind a livery stable? Most people see garbage. Margaret Doyle saw something else entirely, and by the time this story is finished, you will understand exactly what that was. And you will understand why the very same men who laughed at her that August afternoon would, within 4 years, take off their hats when she walked past. But to understand the barn, we have to go back further than Bitter Creek. We have to go back to a smaller settlement in eastern Ohio, some 20 years earlier, to a modest forge shed behind a farmhouse where a girl named Margaret, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sat on an overturned bucket and watched her father work iron. Her father was a blacksmith named Owen Bramwell, a quiet, deliberate man who had learned his trade from an uncle in Pennsylvania and who believed, with the kind of stubborn conviction some men reserve for religion, that iron was the only honest material in the world because it never lied about what it was. Wood rotted and hid its rot beneath good paint. Cloth wore thin and hid its wear beneath a clever seam. But iron, Owen used to say, iron told you everything. A crack showed. A weakness showed. Rust showed. And a good piece of worked iron, cared for properly, would outlast the man who forged it and his son after him, and very likely that son's son as well. Margaret's mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it was her father who raised her. And because there was no one else to mind her while he worked, he simply kept her close, first on the bucket, then at the bellows, then, by the time she was 12, with a small hammer of her own sized to her hand. The other families in the district thought it peculiar, a girl learning the forge instead of the needle. But Owen Bramwell was not a man who cared much what the district thought. What he cared about was teaching his daughter 3 things, and he repeated them to her so often across so many years that she could recite them the way other children recited Scripture. The first was that scrap iron is never worthless, only unrecognized. The second was that patience costs nothing and pays more than any wage a man can offer you. And the third, the one he said most often, the one that would matter most in the end, was this. He would hold up some ruined, twisted piece of metal pulled from a ditch or a burned-out wagon, and he would say to her, "Margaret, a fool sees what a thing is. A smith sees what a thing can become." She heard him say it so many times across so many winters that by the time she was 17, it was not a lesson anymore. It was simply how she looked at the world. Owen Bramwell died of lung trouble when Margaret was 19, coughing through 2 hard winters before the 3rd one finished the job. And he left her his tools, his forge, his small savings, and very little else. Because a country blacksmith in Ohio in those years did not accumulate much beyond what he could pass down in iron and instruction. Margaret married a young farmhand named Thomas Doyle the following spring, mostly, if we are honest, because a woman alone with a forge and no husband was a thing the district found even more peculiar than a girl who could work a hammer. And marrying quieted some of that talk. Thomas was a decent, unremarkable man who wanted, more than anything, to go west and claim land of his own. And so in 1873, the two of them loaded a wagon and joined a slow procession of families crossing into the Kansas territory, chasing the promise of a homestead claim and cheap land and a fresh start. They settled near Bitter Creek. Thomas filed his claim, broke his ground, and for 4 years the two of them scratched out the kind of hard, uncertain living that every homesteading family in that country knew intimately. Good years, followed by drought years, followed by years when the grasshoppers came down like a plague out of Scripture and ate a season's wheat down to bare stalks in a single afternoon. And through all of it, Margaret kept her father's tools in a trunk in the back of their soddy, and every so often, when Thomas was out working the section and there was a broken plow point or a cracked wagon fitting nobody in town had time to mend, she would set up a small anvil behind the house and fix it herself, quietly, the way her father had taught her. Not for money, just because idle iron bothered her the way an unmade bed bothers some people. Then came the winter of 1877, a hard winter even by Kansas standards, and Thomas Doyle caught a fever in January that the local doctor, such as he was, could do nothing for. And by the 2nd week of February, Margaret Doyle was a widow at 26 years old, with a homestead claim she could not legally hold in her own name under the laws of the territory at that time, a debt to the land office that had to be settled, and a trunk of blacksmithing tools that most of Bitter Creek considered a curiosity rather than an asset. She lost the claim within the year, unable to meet the residency and improvement requirements alone. And by the spring of 1878 she was, in the plainest terms, homeless, taking a room above the mercantile when she had coin for it, and sleeping in the Pruitt family's old cattle barn, with their grudging permission, when she did not. The town of Bitter Creek watched all of this happen and drew the conclusion that towns often draw about a woman in her circumstances, which is that she was unlucky, or unlucky, or perhaps simply not quite right in the head, because what other explanation could there be for a homeless widow who spent what little money she scraped together not on bread, but on broken iron? Let me tell you what was happening inside that barn, because this is the part the town did not see, and it is the part that matters most. Margaret Doyle had set up her father's anvil in the back corner of the Pruitt barn, behind a partition of old grain sacks, and every single scrap of rusted, bent, discarded iron she could acquire for pennies she brought there. Horseshoes thrown out because a horse had thrown a shoe, and the smith judged it not worth the reshaping. Wagon tire iron from wrecked wheels nobody wanted to haul off. Broken plowshares, cracked skillets, bent nails swept up off a floor and sold by the pound because nobody thought to do anything else with them. She bought a rusted horseshoe for 4 cents outside the livery that August afternoon in 1879, because it was, in fact, a very fine piece of iron beneath the rust, forged by a smith who had known his trade, and Margaret's eye, trained across 2 decades by her father, could tell the difference between iron that was merely ugly and iron that was ruined, and this was only ugly. She heated it that same evening in a forge built from salvaged brick and an old bellows Thomas had once used for something else entirely, and by lamplight she reworked it, straightened the bend, cleaned the rust, resized it, and set it aside in a growing stack of horseshoes that, by that point in the summer of 1879, numbered perhaps 40 pieces. She was not selling them yet. She was not doing anything with them at all, in the eyes of anyone who might have looked. She was simply accumulating, quietly, methodically, the way her father had taught her, because scrap iron was never worthless, only unrecognized, and because patience, he had told her 100 times, costs nothing and pays more than any wage a man can offer you. You have to understand what the rest of Bitter Creek was doing during these same years, because the contrast is the whole engine of this story. This was a boom period for the cattle trade moving up from Texas, and land prices around the rail spurs were climbing in a way that made ordinary men feel, for the first time in their lives, like they might get rich quickly instead of slowly. Ranchers and shopkeepers alike were borrowing heavily against future herds and future harvests, buying more cattle than their range could properly support, more equipment than their operations truly needed, more land than they could responsibly work, all of it financed through notes at the territorial bank in the county seat, all of it resting on the assumption that beef prices and land values would simply keep climbing the way they had climbed for 3 or 4 good years running. A man named Everett Pruitt, whose family owned the barn Margaret slept in some nights, was perhaps the most eager of all of them, having taken out note after note to expand his herd and his acreage, buying goodwill in town by being loud and generous and confident. The kind of man who bought a round at the saloon and told anyone who would listen that Bitter Creek was 3 years from being a real city, and that any fool could see the smart money was in borrowing now to buy in before prices climbed higher still. He was not a cruel man, Everett Pruitt, and it should be said plainly that he was among those who laughed outside the livery that August afternoon, not out of meanness exactly, but out of the particular contempt that a man riding high on borrowed money sometimes feels for a woman who owns nothing but scrap iron and patience. Margaret worked for 4 years like this, largely unnoticed, because a homeless widow going about her business behind a barn wall of grain sacks is precisely the kind of person a busy, expanding town has no reason to watch closely. By the winter of 1880, her stack of reworked horseshoes had grown past 200, sorted by size on a shelf she had built herself from salvaged lumber, each one straightened, cleaned of rust, and fitted correctly, ready to be nailed onto a hoof without a farrier having to do a single hour of extra work. She had also, by then, begun quietly repairing other things. Wagon tire iron she reshaped and resold to a wheelwright 2 towns over, who did not ask too many questions about where a widow was getting good iron so cheap, so long as the price was right and the work was sound. Cracked plowshares she mended and sold back into circulation for 1/3 of what a new one cost from the mail-order catalog. None of this made her rich. It made her, slowly, almost invisibly, solvent. And then it made her, more slowly still, something like prosperous, in the narrow, unglamorous way that a person becomes prosperous when they spend 4 years converting other people's garbage into other people's tools at a fair price with no debt hanging over any of it. Let me linger a moment on what those 4 quiet years actually looked like day to day, because it is easy to say a woman worked patiently and move on, and much harder to understand what patience of that kind actually costs a person. Margaret rose before dawn most mornings, not because anyone required it of her, but because the forge drew heat slowly, and she preferred to have her fire well established before the barn's other business, the horses and the hired hands moving through on Pruitt errands, made the space too crowded to work comfortably. She ate plainly, often nothing more than cornbread and whatever the mercantile owner, a kindly widower named Purcell, who never once mentioned her circumstances aloud, was willing to trade her for small repairs done around his own storeroom. Her dark red dress, the one she had been married in, thinned at the cuffs and grew a small tear at the shoulder that she mended so many times the patch itself eventually needed patching, and she wore it through summer heat and winter cold alike, because a second dress was a luxury that would have meant fewer nails purchased for the shelving, or less coal for the forge, and she had long since decided which she valued more. She kept a small ledger in her father's old hand-me-down script, recording every scrap of iron she acquired and its price down to the penny, not because anyone asked her to account for it, but because Owen Bramwell had taught her that a smith who does not know exactly what a thing cost her cannot know exactly what it is worth, and a smith who cannot say what a thing is worth has no business selling it. Some evenings, sitting by the low light of her forge fire after a full day's work, she allowed herself to imagine what her father would say if he could see the shelves filling behind the grain sacks, and she believed, without ever needing to say it aloud to another living soul, that he would have approved of every single choice she had made since the day she buried him. There was one man in Bitter Creek who did not laugh outside the livery that day, or if he did, he stopped laughing sooner than the others. His name was Reuben Osgood, a rancher who ran a modest but well-managed herd on land east of town, a man known for being careful with his money in an era when careful men were often mocked as timid. Reuben's saddle horse threw a shoe on a hot afternoon in the spring of 1881, some distance from town, and rather than ride the animal lame all the way back to the smithy, he happened to remember that the widow Doyle kept a stock of shoes out at the Pruitt barn, a fact most of the town knew only as gossip and treated as one more piece of evidence of her strangeness. He rode over, found her behind the grain sack partition, working the bellows with the easy, practiced rhythm of someone who had done it every day of her life, and asked, somewhat doubtfully, if she had a shoe that might fit a 16-hand gelding with a narrow hoof. She looked at the horse for perhaps 4 seconds, walked to her shelf, and handed him exactly the right size on the first try. He asked what he owed her. She told him a price that was less than half what the smithy in town charged for new work. He paid her, thanked her, and rode away. And it would have ended there, one small transaction, except that the shoe held perfectly through 6 weeks of hard riding over rough country. And Reuben Osgood was not a man who forgot a piece of good, honest work when he saw one. He came back in the fall, this time with 2 more horses needing shoes and a broken singletree he'd been putting off having repaired because the smithy quoted him a price he thought was robbery. Margaret fixed the singletree in an afternoon for a fraction of that price, and did it, moreover, in a way that Reuben, who had worked plenty of iron himself in a rough farmhand way over the years, recognized as genuinely skilled rather than merely serviceable. He asked her, standing there in the Pruitt barn with the afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards, where she had learned to work iron like that. And she told him, in the plain, unadorned way she told most things, about her father, Owen Bramwell, and his forge in Ohio, and the 3 things he had taught her. And when she got to the 3rd thing, the line about a fool seeing what a thing is, while a smith sees what a thing can become, Reuben Osgood went quiet for a moment, and then said, "Ma'am, I believe your father was a wiser man than most of the fellows drinking at the saloon tonight." It was not a large compliment, as compliments go, but it was the first one Margaret Doyle had received in Bitter Creek in 3 years, and she remembered it for the rest of her life. Reuben became, over the following 2 years, something the town would later recognize as her first real customer of standing. A respected rancher who was not shy about telling other ranchers, when the subject of shoeing and repair came up, that the widow Doyle out of the Pruitt place did better work for less money than anyone in the county seat, and if a man had sense, he would swallow his pride and go see her himself. Word travels slowly in a scattered ranching country, but it does travel, and by the spring of 1883, Margaret Doyle had a small but steady trickle of customers who came to her not because they respected her exactly, not yet, but because her prices were fair and her work outlasted work done elsewhere for twice the cost. She still slept some nights in the barn and some nights above the mercantile, still wore dresses gone thin and patched at the elbow, still looked, to anyone passing on the road, like exactly the kind of unlucky, unremarkable widow that Bitter Creek had long ago decided she was. What none of them knew, because none of them had bothered to look past the partition of grain sacks, was that behind that wall she had, by that spring, accumulated a stock of finished horseshoes and repaired iron goods worth, by careful count, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 at fair market value, all of it built from scrap that had cost her, across 4 years, perhaps $30 total, and all of it held free and clear, with not 1 cent of debt against any of it. Compare that, if you will, to Everett Pruitt, whose herd, by that same spring, had grown large and handsome to look at, and whose notes at the Territorial Bank had grown right alongside it, because that is what happens when a man borrows against a future that has not yet arrived. And then, in the summer of 1883, the future that had not yet arrived all at once, and it arrived badly. A combination of overexpanded herds flooding the beef market, a sharp contraction in credit from banks back east that had themselves overextended through the boom years, and 2 consecutive dry seasons that thinned the grass across the whole territory, brought what the old-timers in that part of Kansas would speak of for decades afterward simply as the reckoning. Beef prices that had been climbing for 4 straight years fell by nearly half within a single season. The Territorial Bank in the county seat, itself squeezed by its own creditors back east, began calling in notes it had been comfortable letting ride during the boom, demanding payment or foreclosure with a suddenness that caught nearly every borrower in the district flat-footed. Let me tell you exactly what this meant for a man like Everett Pruitt. It meant that a herd worth, on paper, $30,000 the year before was suddenly worth perhaps $16,000 at the depressed prices buyers were willing to pay, while the notes against that herd and against his expanded acreage still stood at their original value, unmoved and unmoving, demanding full payment in coin that no longer existed in the quantities the boom years had promised. Pruitt was not alone. Across Bitter Creek and the surrounding country, ranchers and merchants who had borrowed heavily during the good years found themselves that autumn owning land and cattle worth far less than what they owed against them, and the bank, desperate for its own solvency, began foreclosing without much patience for anyone's excuses. It was in the middle of this reckoning, in October of 1883, that the county held what everyone in Bitter Creek simply called the auction, a foreclosure sale of equipment, tools, and stock seized from 3 different overextended operations, held on a Saturday in the open lot beside the land office, with half the county turned out either to buy at desperate prices or simply to watch the spectacle of their neighbor's misfortune, which is its own kind of entertainment in a small place. Among the items on the auction block that day was a wagon load of tire iron, plowshares, and assorted ironwork seized from a failed freighting operation. Iron in rough shape, rusted from sitting exposed through a wet spring, the kind of lot that most bidders looked at and saw only scrap, worth perhaps a few dollars for the metal weight alone. The auctioneer, a brisk man named Corliss, who ran these sales for the county, opened the bidding low, expecting little interest. Margaret Doyle, standing near the back of the crowd in her patched, dark red dress, the same one she had been wearing, mended and remended, for 3 years running, raised her hand and bid $11 for the entire wagon load. There was laughter, of course, because there is always laughter when the widow Doyle does anything in public. Laughter and a few low comments about a beggar woman throwing away good money on junk. And Everett Pruitt himself, standing not far off, still trying to salvage what he could from his own collapsing operation, laughed loudest of all, loud enough that Corliss, the auctioneer, paused and looked over, and loud enough that Margaret Doyle heard every word of it clearly across the open lot. Nobody outbid her. $11 was, after all, more than most people in that crowd thought the load was worth, and so the wagon of rusted iron became hers, and men shook their heads and went back to watching the more interesting business of the day, which was the sale of Pruitt's own remaining stock and equipment, as the bank moved, that same afternoon, to seize what it could to offset his defaulted notes. Here is where the story turns, and I want you to picture it exactly as it happened. Later that same afternoon, as the crowd was thinning and the shadows were getting long across the lot, word went around that the bank examiner and Corliss, the auctioneer, were preparing to inspect and appraise a barn full of equipment belonging to a rancher 2 sections over, a man named Otis Faraday, who had also defaulted and needed, before the winter, a working set of plowshares and wagon tire iron to keep his one remaining rented section producing enough to feed his family through the reckoning. Faraday had no money for new equipment, and the smithy in town, itself squeezed for cash in the credit contraction, was demanding payment up front that Faraday simply did not have. It was Reuben Osgood, standing nearby, who suggested, loud enough for a good number of people to hear, that Faraday go ask the widow Doyle what she might have out at the Pruitt barn, since Osgood himself had bought plenty of good iron off her at half the smithy's price over the past 2 years. Faraday, desperate enough not to care what the crowd thought, rode out to the Pruitt barn that same evening. What Otis Faraday saw when Margaret Doyle pulled back the partition of grain sacks was, by his own later account, the single most astonishing thing he witnessed in that entire hard year. Shelves, built by her own hand from salvaged lumber, ran the length of the back wall, stacked with more than 300 finished horseshoes sorted by size, dozens of repaired and resharpened plowshares, coils of straightened and cleaned wagon tire iron ready to be fitted, mended singletrees, reworked wagon fittings, tools of every description that a working farm or ranch needed and could not easily do without, all of it produced, over 4 patient years, from scrap that the rest of the county had thrown away or sold for pennies by the pound. Faraday stood in the doorway of that barn for a long moment without saying a word, and then, according to the story he told for the rest of his life, he took off his hat, which is a thing men in that country did not do lightly, and he said, "Ma'am, I believe I've been laughing at the wrong person for 4 years running." Margaret Doyle looked at him and said only, "Most people have, Mr. Faraday. It never troubled me much." She outfitted his whole operation that evening, plowshares and tire iron and 24 horseshoes, at a price he could actually pay, and Otis Faraday rode home in the dark that night, a man who had gone from despair to solvency in the space of a single conversation. He did not keep it quiet. By the end of that week, in the particular way that news travels through a small ranching county during a hard season, when everyone is looking for any sign of good fortune, half of Bitter Creek knew what was behind the grain sack partition in the Pruitt barn, and the other half knew within the fortnight. Ranchers, desperate for equipment they could no longer afford new, men whose credit at the smithy had run out entirely, began arriving at that barn in a steady stream through that autumn and winter, and Margaret Doyle, who had spent 4 years building an inventory nobody wanted to look at, spent the following 6 months selling nearly all of it at fair prices to a county full of men who suddenly had no other option, and, more slowly, to men who simply recognized good, honest ironwork when they finally saw it laid out in front of them. By the spring of 1884, Margaret Doyle had enough saved, clear of debt, to buy outright the very section of land the Pruitt barn stood on, since Everett Pruitt himself, having lost most of his herd and half his acreage to the bank's foreclosure, was selling off what remained of his holdings simply to keep a roof over his own family's heads. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a small town when the person everyone laughed at ends up owning the ground the joke was told on, and Bitter Creek fell into that particular quiet through the spring and summer of 1884. It was at a community gathering that autumn, a harvest supper held in the yard outside the church, that someone finally asked Margaret Doyle, in front of a good portion of the town, the question that had been sitting unasked for 5 years. It was Corliss, the auctioneer, of all people, who asked it, standing near the long tables with a plate in his hand, saying, "Mrs. Doyle, I've wondered for a long while now, and I expect I'm not alone in it. How does a woman with nothing build what you've built, while the rest of us with everything ended up with so little?" The yard went quiet in that particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it is about to hear something true. Margaret set down the cup she was holding and thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "My father used to tell me that a fool sees what a thing is, and a smith sees what a thing can become." He wasn't only talking about iron. Most of you were looking at debt and calling it prosperity because it looked like something already finished. I was looking at scrap and calling it opportunity because I could see what 4 patient years would make of it. Patience isn't free, Mr. Corliss. It costs you looking foolish for longer than most people can stand. But it never once costs you what you don't have. And it never once takes more from you than you agreed to give it. That's the whole of it. That's all my father ever taught me, and it's the only thing I've ever needed to know. Nobody laughed. A few of the older ranchers standing near the tables looked down at their boots, and Everett Pruitt, who had come to the supper that year as a much humbler man than he had been 5 years before, was seen to nod slowly, as if the words had landed somewhere they needed to land. Margaret Doyle went on, over the following decade, to run what became the most respected forge and repair operation in that stretch of Kansas, built on the same principle her father had taught her, and that she had proven true in front of an entire county: that patience applied to overlooked material, whether it is iron or land or a person's own reputation, pays a return that borrowed confidence never can. She never remarried, choosing instead to raise her late brother's orphaned niece, a quiet, watchful girl named Alma, who came to live with her in 1886 after a fever took both of the girl's parents in a neighboring county, and Margaret raised Alma the same way her own father had raised her, keeping her close at the forge from the time she was old enough to work a small bellows, teaching her to sort good scrap from ruined scrap by eye and by ear, by the sound a piece of iron made when you struck it lightly, and by the way rust sat differently on metal that was merely neglected than on metal that was truly finished. On a spring evening in 1891, with Alma now a capable young woman of her own, sorting a fresh delivery of scrap iron behind that same barn, now considerably expanded, Margaret watched her work for a moment, picked up a bent, rusted horseshoe from the pile, held it out to her, and said the same words her father had said to her more than 30 years before in a forge shed in Ohio on an overturned bucket, before any of this had happened at all. "A fool sees what a thing is," she said. "A smith sees what a thing can become." Alma turned the horseshoe over in her hands, studied the bend and the rust for a long moment the way she had been taught, and set it aside on the shelf reserved for iron worth saving. "So let me ask you the same question this whole story has been asking from the very start. What do you see when you look at something the world has already thrown away? Whether it's a bent horseshoe behind a livery stable, or a person nobody in town thinks is worth a second glance. Because Bitter Creek, Kansas, spent 4 years believing it already knew the answer, and it took a reckoning, an auction, and one very patient widow to teach an entire county that it had been wrong the whole time. If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to stick around, subscribe to the channel, and join me for the next one, because there are a great many more stories like this one out there, about people the world underestimated right up until the moment it couldn't anymore. And I intend to keep telling them for as long as you'll keep watching. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next story.